Ansley, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about Toplines and all of the things that go with it.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoy this topic as well. I think there's a lot to dive into. So,
Awesome. So let's start here. We need to understand, before things go wrong, what does a healthy, functional top line do for the horse? So when we're looking at a horse and maybe we're thinking about just their normal kind of locomotion, their normal life, and then also in terms of performance, the top line group of muscles, I suppose. What are they? What do they do for the horse when they are functioning correctly?
so we have to understand that the top line also includes deeper back muscles. So we have muscles within the back that actually support the spine and that are supporting those vertebrae that make up the spine. So when we think of the top line and we think of the back and why it's important, it's not only important because, oh, the rider sits on the back and the back is supporting the rider and the saddle and those types of things, but it's also supporting the anatomy in general. So any mobilization of the spine, those back muscles are a part of that. So for the horse to partake in flexion of the spine, extension of the spine, lateral bending, so from side to side, anything like that, those are going to be, back muscles are a part of that. So it's really important in, just like you were saying, the horse's everyday life for grazing, reaching things, lateral bending, rubbing their nose on their knee, anything like that. You need the back to be able to function to do those things. So it's not just for horses in ridden work. It also needs to be mobile and tension free and healthy and thriving for horses that are unridden as well.
I think oftentimes when we talk about, oh, I want to build up my horse's top line, we are really thinking about what we can see, that we want the back to look a certain way. I've heard a lot of people who participate in the hunters and the hunter confirmation classes talk about this, that they want to see a nice healthy top line, that they want to build up a top line. Let's talk about in motion. So if we're observing a horse in motion, whether it's on the lunge or trotting around in the field, when a rider is not on its back, is there anything that indicates to you that the top line is functioning well, that you're seeing in motion with the horse?
I would say a healthy functioning top line that's well developed, that's tension free. A lot of times, an important part of that visually, besides just a beefy hunter looking horse, is going to be the horse's movement is directly influenced from the top line and the elasticity that's moving. Because if you think about the horse in motion, yes, the limbs are what help create mobility for the horse, but this inertia and this movement travels from the horse's poll all the way through the cervical, all the way through the back, and then down through the hind end. So you need to have the elasticity, and that passes directly through the back. So it's not just, oh, I want a well-developed longissimus muscle so that my horse can look good conformationally. It's you need it in general for the horse's movement, for their motion. A lot of times when you have a horse who is underdeveloped through the top line or has pain or has tension through the back, through the spine, and through those supporting muscles, you will see a horse that is not very fluid. There's not a lot of elasticity that's going through the entire body because they're bracing, they're either in pain or they don't have the properly developed musculature to support that nice floaty trot, that nice fluid canter, or even, a regular lengthy pain-free walk. So those are some of the things that you'll see in a horse even just without a rider when we're looking at underdevelopment or perhaps an unhealthy top line.
Are there any kinds of oftentimes when I find that when my veterinarian or my body worker, for instance, is trying to explain something to me, they have a lot of metaphors in their pocket to explain something about how it relates to humans. Do you have any sort of metaphors about how we can think about the top line from what we understand about humans? I mean, I have had, like, in one of my pregnancies, I had back pain, and it was honestly so debilitating. Like, I would rather go through labor again than have back pain. And so then I think about, if a horse has back pain and then you're also putting a rider on it, I don't know if that's really equivalent, but I think you probably understand what I'm getting at. Like when we think about dysfunction in the top line, is that similar to like us having a back problem? Are there any kind of metaphors that we can kind of understand the horse's experience with a functional or a dysfunctional top line?
I would say let's circle back to the pain you were speaking about when you talked about, oh, you'd rather go through giving birth again than having back pain. So let's just relate it to that sense. And when a human is in pain, it makes you grumpy, right? You're grumpy, you're unhappy. It makes it difficult for you to do
Yes,
your job. It's really
definitely.
it seeps through all aspects of your life. So you can think about it the same for the horse. And this will probably come up later on in our chat as well, but we have to understand that the horse is an extremely stoic being. Yes, there are more expressive horses than others. Some of them will just come across more quiet or more docile, but that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that that horse is not going through discomfort and pain if they have an underdeveloped top line or they have pain or tension in the back, and then we're adding a rider to that and we're adding an ill-fitting saddle to it, all of these things, because as the human we tend to look at the superficial portion of it. We tend to think, well, they're not actively wailing and falling over or biting
Right.
me or doing these crazy dramatic things, but we have to think, how often do you really see a horse doing those things? It's not actually that often, unless you've gotten to the nth degree of the scale where things are just really terrible. You might see a horse behaving that way and kind of eliciting those pain responses, but for the most part the communication is fairly mild. So when we talk about equating it to a human, I think we are able to be much more vocal and we're actionably able to do things about a slight amount of pain, where obviously the horse is very different in that sense. Another thing I will say, because a lot of humans, the human side of things, we do you'll see a lot of times people will throw their backs out. It's very common. And that's typically because you have tension and you have weakness and you have a lack of flexibility. So those are three important things in the massage therapy world, in the physical therapy world, in the rehabilitation world that crosses over from humans to horses. Those things are very important to have as a person. If you have a lack of flexibility, if you are not well developed and you lean over or you move too quick or you try to pick up something too heavy, you're going to have an injury. That's how you get hurt. Well, the same thing happens for the horse. If the horse is ill-equipped, so if they're underdeveloped, if they don't have the proper amount of mobility, if they have tension that's present, that's when you're going to have an injury occur. So the same thing, it kind of correlates from the human world to the horse world in that sense as well.
That's interesting because I think that when we think about what we're talking about today, which is really like top line dysfunction, we think of that as, at least I do, like a slow withering away over time. Like it's very slow and it's very gradual. But I think what you're speaking about is there can be there's a chronic element to that, absolutely, but that can also result in like acute pain if the horse has weakness or tension overall. Even chronically, that can result in what presents as an acute injury.
Yeah, so I would say you're exactly right. There is the chronic aspect to it where if you have these long term compensational movement patterns where tension is placed on a portion of a distal limb and then you end up with a tendon or ligament injury later on down the road because the horse was ill equipped to kind of deal with what was happening, yes, that can be a more chronic example, but absolutely we can have acute pain and discomfort. For example, if you have a horse that is being ridden and they have an underdeveloped top line, so therefore they're not moving correctly, they're not moving in a biomechanically correct way, so we're seeing a lot of hollowness through the back, we're seeing a lot of extension through the spine. Immediately after that ride, you can get off that horse and palpate their back, and I would say you've got almost 100% chance that they're going to have back pain, especially in that saddle support area where, I think we've all ridden a horse where for a period of time maybe they were spooking or we just couldn't get them nice and round and supple. Maybe they were brand new to being ridden. Maybe they were having an off day, or maybe we were having an off day, whatever it was. But it's not comfortable for the rider either when you have a very hollowed out back and you have no contact with the horse. They're not in a nice round and engaged frame. I mean, it's uncomfortable for the rider and it's also uncomfortable for the horse. That's the type of scenario I would say you would see a more acute kind of painful reaction from them.
Let's talk about some of those signs of dysfunction that people listening and riders and horse owners can start to look out for. This is something that you explain in video form in the Topline program that you did for Equestrian Masterclass, and you kind of looked at it in terms of assessing your horse's top line in sort of 3 zones from an observational perspective. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's very easy for equestrians when we use the word top line, we can get very hung up on just the middle portion of the back, for lack of a better term. Let's call it saddle support area, middle portion of the back. When in reality, to me, and perhaps some other practitioners in the field, I view the top line as more than just the saddle support area, more than just the middle of the back, because the muscles that are involved in the back and the top line run from the cervical all the way down to the haunches. So I kind of like to break it up into 3 parts. I like to look at kind of the wither and the scapula and the shoulder area where the base of the neck comes into the back. I like to look there and see what's going on and assess development. And then I like to look at the middle of the back, so more of our saddle support area. And then I like to even move behind that to the more thoracolumbar fascia, moving into the haunches and that kind of sacral area. So I like to look at that as well, because those 2 areas, the fore and the latter, so the haunches and then kind of the wither and scapula region, can be very, very telling when it comes to muscular development. I mean, when we're seeing a very shark-finned wither that is super prominent and we really have a lack of development through the trapezius muscle and things like that, that's a very big indication that we have a problem going on. And same with the haunches. So if we're looking at the hind end and where the sacrum is coming out into those bony landmarks of the pelvis, if those are very prominent, we've got underdevelopment of the gluteals. We most likely have some issues or some tension going on with the thoracolumbar fascia. I mean, these can both be very telling areas where it can help us pinpoint what's going on.
As a body worker yourself, when you're putting hands on these horses that when you look at them, maybe they do have underdevelopment, they do have that kind of shark fin wither, and you put hands on them, what do those dysfunctional or underdeveloped muscles feel like to your hands versus a horse that has a functional, well-muscled top line?
So typically a horse that is underdeveloped but is still in work, not just a horse that's sitting around and is maybe lush and fat and happy. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a horse who is underdeveloped for the job that they're doing. Typically, that tissue, that muscle, that fascia will feel very tight and very tense, and it can feel very painful to the horse as well. So if you're palpating, I personally will feel tension within the tissue, and then I will see some pain responses from the horse most likely. Whereas if you have developed muscle, it's kind of, and this is something that you might not be able to grasp just from hearing it. You would have to kind of learn this over time, putting your hands on more horses, so you can compare and gauge the tissue. But typically, healthy muscle tissue does not feel too tight and it does not feel too squishy. You have a nice kind of elasticity to it. Trying to think of how you would explain it. Like if you kind of flexed your bicep and you were somebody who worked out moderately, you weren't a couch potato, but you weren't a bodybuilder, what would that feel like? It would feel a little bit squishy because it's still skin and tissue and dermis and fascia and blood. So it would feel a little squishy, so not too hard, not too soft. Those are kinds of the tonicity that you're looking for when you're palpating and when you're feeling healthy muscle tissue. But I'd say the biggest indication of underdevelopment and tension is going to be just very hard, there's going to be a lack of fluidity, a lack of movement, even if you kind of would, and we're not talking just putting pressure, but if you're almost putting your hand and you're kind of moving the skin and the muscle kind of up and down, not just pushing pressure towards, but if you're trying to slide left and right, up and down, unhealthy or tense tissue and fascia is not going to have a lot of movement to it. So you're not going to be able to kind of move things very easily. It's going to be very tight and very tense.
Okay. You mentioned that on some of those horses that they will indicate to you that they have pain or discomfort. What are some of those signs that we may often be ignoring in our horses as, well, he's just grumpy. Well, that's just how he is. I mean, we've already established in this conversation that when humans are in pain, it it really affects your personality.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of your
Absolutely.
view of the world. And so, so often we have these horses that are grumpy, and certainly not all of that. We can talk about ulcers. There's tons of different things that we can talk
Yeah.
about with that. But what are some of those pain signals and responses that horses use to communicate to you when you're palpating them? I don't like that.
So I think some of the more obvious ones will be ear pinning, teeth grinding, attempting to nip, attempting to kick, lifting a hind leg, attempting to kick. We have tail swishing that can be a big one. When you're looking at the actual tissue localized or even kind of associated, if you're doing palpation, you might see some muscle fasciculations or twitching or spasms, things like that. You might see the horse abruptly move away from your touch or gradually move away from your touch, like they're just kind of inching away from you. Hey, this is a little bit annoying, I don't like this. Or, might be very dramatic, like if you're palpating through the gluteals, they might drop a hip quickly or something like that. You might also, some more subtle signs might be if you have kind of a more pursed lip or a very tight mouth, tight nostril, things like that. It's something that's also kind of hard to relay if you're not used to seeing it, can be visually a horse that's shut down. So this is very different from a horse who is just sleeping on the cross ties, very relaxed, exhales, not like that. That's not what we're talking about. A shut down horse can look almost like they're frozen in a fight or flight response. You know what I mean? So they're kind of sort of waiting for the next shoe to drop. They might have a little bit more of an alert eye, but they're frozen because they don't really know how they're supposed to react. So that can be something that's a little bit more nuanced that some equestrians might not be aware to look at in terms of a pain response. I think that those are kind of the the static things you can look at, whereas there might be other dynamic pain responses. And when I say dynamic, I mean when the horse is in motion, when they're moving or being ridden. So that might be when you have a horse who is struggling with lead changes, or a horse who's got a lot of tail swishing going on, a horse who's constantly bucking or kicking out under saddle, a horse that's refusing fences, a horse that's rearing, a horse that's jigging a lot in place, crow hopping, those types of things that a lot of times we're notoriously guilty for giving our horses these quote unquote personality traits or these characteristics. We're personifying these things, oh, well, this is just a spicy mare and this is how she is. When in reality, hey, if you looked a little bit deeper, is that actually a pain response? Like, can we link that to something that's going on in the body? So I would say those are a little bit more of your dynamic pain responses that you would look for versus static.
When you see a horse with underdevelopment of the top line, and that horse is in work, so again, we're not talking about like my 20-year-old
Yeah.
horse who's retired in the field and is like the top line's not looking like it did when he was 10 and in a lot of work. But those horses that are in work and underdeveloped, do you find that they always have pain, that they always that back muscle is always pain? I guess what I'm asking is, can you be underdeveloped and in work but not painful clinically?
Yes, I would say yes, you can. More often, I would say the underdeveloped top lines that I see do go hand in hand with pain, but we also see it the other way around, where you can have a horse that is developed but also in pain. So you don't
Oh,
always just
interesting. Okay.
yeah, you don't, and I'm not sure if you'll see that in the top line program or not, but we did work with a horse who was developed through the top line but was in pain. So it's not always, let me think of the word I'm trying to say. It's not always it doesn't always directly correlate like you think it would. But I would say more often, yes, I see underdevelopment go hand in hand with pain, and it's not incredibly common to see a very well developed healthy top line in pain, because typically pain and underdevelopment, they are peas in a pod, they work
Okay.
together. So
Okay. But the point being, when we're really thinking about assessing the horse's top line, you can't just do that from looking at a photo or looking at them standing in the field. Like if you really want to really want to assess the functionality of their top line, you're going to want to put hands on them. You're going to want to look at them, and you're going to do a physical observation. And then I would assume you would also ideally like to see them in some form of movement as well.
yes, for me as a practitioner in the field, I like to do all of those things. So I do a static assessment, which is just kind of their standing, and I do a visual, how does this horse like to stand? Where are they most comfortable? Which legs are they resting? Are they favoring anything? And then you approach the horse. Okay, are they giving me any indication that they don't want me near them, or that they're uncomfortable with me about to put my hands on them? Anything like that. Because a horse who is already indicating to you, as a newcomer getting near them, that they're not welcoming you, it means one, that they are unhappy with their relationship that they've had with a human, which can a lot of times be directly correlated to something painful that's going on. Something else that I like to do is when the tack is brought out, are you having a different reaction from the horse? When the saddle comes out, when the girth comes out, anything like that is something to be aware of. And then, yes, obviously I like to do the palpation. So when I'm putting my hands on the back, putting my hands on the body, what am I feeling? And then in addition to that, what is that horse's response telling me? And then I like to do the dynamic aspect of it, which is seeing the horse in motion. So this would typically encompass seeing the horse without a rider and then seeing them with a rider, because that's going to be a big indication, especially when you're looking at the back and the top line. If that horse is showing you a very different movement pattern, a very different flow, different gaits, different stride length, things like that, without a rider versus with a rider, that's a pretty big indication that you've got something going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you estimate for us, roughly, this is not scientific, and I did not ask you to prepare this, can you estimate, in your experience, what percentage of horses that you work on would you say have some level of top line dysfunction and or back pain?
I can easily say over 50%.
Wow.
Over 50,
Okay.
yeah, I would say over 50% have back pain and or underdevelopment through the top line and through the back. Yeah, I would say, I'm trying to think of maybe a more accurate number, but I think baseline, I can easily say it's over 50%, maybe in the range of 60 to 70%. And when you
Wow.
look at, and this is a little bit unrelated, but when you look at the studies and correlation to what's been going on with kissing spine, this is not necessarily a super shocking number. So, not saying that it's always related, not saying that if a horse has an underdeveloped top line that they definitely have a kissing spine issue. That's not what I'm saying. But in general, when you look at those statistics that we do have in terms of kissing spine and that pathology, it's not that shocking that 60 to 70% of horses palpate painful through the back and have underdevelopment of the back musculature.
If anyone is listening to this and their ears are perking up about kissing spine, we actually did a full episode. It's quite in depth about kissing spine and all of the different treatment options. We go into rehab, we go into symptoms, prognosis, all of that sort of thing. So I can't remember off the top of my head what episode number that is, but if you scroll back in Equestrian Voices, we do have an entire episode dedicated to kissing spine because it's so common, and we got so many people saying, "Can you please do one on kissing spines?"
Yeah.
Okay, moving forward, I want to talk about, and this is another episode that we've done in depth. I want to talk about the relationship briefly between top line and saddle fit, because one of the things that you said earlier is so many people associate assessing the top line with that space of the horse's back that carries the saddle. And we've become more aware of the necessity of saddle fit and the effect of saddle fit on not just performance, but on horse welfare.
Yes.
in, in recent years, especially. And so this has to be, I think, part of the conversation about a healthy or an unhealthy top line. Talk to me a little bit about what just the relationship that you're seeing between. I know you're not a saddle fitter, but just as a body
Yeah.
worker from that side of things, how you're seeing that relationship.
Yeah. It became very clear to me very early on in in my career with this that you cannot not involve saddle fit. Saddle fit is very important in muscular development, but also just in hands-on work. So if you're working on a horse and you're feeling pain and tension, but you have no idea where it's coming from, then you have to incorporate that saddle knowledge into your practice. So like you said, no, I'm not a fitter, but I do have education when it comes to saddle fit and things that we're looking for, things that we're looking at. And I would say that there are many, many horses that I have worked on in the past, that I work on currently, and that I see often that do not have proper fitting saddles, and that directly correlates with the pain and tension that I'm feeling in the back and in the body. It directly correlates with the horse's movement patterns, and it directly correlates with, at times, underlying pathologies such as kissing spine and things like that. So, I mean, saddle fit, and I'm sure you guys have had this discussion, I believe, with Amanda, so I'm sure you're well covered there, but saddle fit, it's very different than a brand rep. A brand rep versus a saddle fitter who knows their salt and knows the anatomy of the horse and knows the biomechanics of the horse. That's what matters. And if you have a brand rep that can do both of those things, then fine, great. But that is the key part of it. If you don't understand the motion of the horse and you don't understand what the muscles do, what the action is, then you're not going to understand how to fit the horse. And that's when we start to see the ill-fitting saddles that are really presenting a problem with the trapezius muscle, and not just that, but longissimus, all of those muscles that run through the back and the thoracic region, and we start to see that take a toll on the horse's movement patterns. And that can look like many things. It can look like the extension through the spine with the hollowness, and then that creates overdevelopment of those ventral muscles in the cervical region. So we start to see overdevelopment and tension through the brachiocephalicus muscle through the neck. We start to see the horse bracing through the haunches and the sacrum. I mean, it's a chain reaction. It goes everywhere. It affects everything. So you're not just looking at an underdeveloped back. You're looking at, now we have the entire movement pattern has been affected from this.
I want to understand very clearly how the atrophy process happens. So my question is, when we have pain in the back, whether it's we'll say it's from saddle fit, you have an ill-fitting saddle. How does the ill-fitting saddle, and we put an ill-fitting saddle on a horse that has a fine top line, a normal, healthy top line. Mm-hmm. How do we go from putting an ill-fitting saddle on a horse with a normal, healthy top line to a horse that then has atrophy in the back? Is it because they stop utilizing the muscles that become painful? Like, how does that atrophy happen?
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to think of how to explain it without getting too overly nerdy with the anatomy of it. So if you put an ill-fitting saddle on a developed top line and you just do it a couple of times, you're probably going to be fine. You'll probably be okay. But it is the concept of, if you keep doing it and that pain and then there becomes pain and tension and inflammation and also lack of circulation at times, depending on what's going on, then you have stopped the ability. When there is pain present, the muscle cannot develop properly, and that's just the facts of the case. That is, it doesn't matter if you're pumping all the nutrition into the horse and you're doing all the daily exercises. It doesn't matter if there's pain present. That muscle is not going to develop properly, and that's part of the fascial system as well. So fascia actually has an electric component to it when it comes to the neurons and the pain responses. So when we talk about muscle memory, You know how you just something's so second nature to you, or a muscle just kind of is so used to being built and it'll stay built forever. Fascia has that same thing. So when fascia, except to a detriment. So when you have a trauma or you have pain, the fascial system will constrict, and that's part of the reason why you will not see the proper development, because you have the fascial restriction and you have that tension that's prohibiting part of the process that prohibits the muscle from building and growing. So that's part of it. The other part of it is when there's pain, that's when you start to see compensatory movement happening. And when you have compensatory movement, the body's not moving in the proper way to build the muscle. So it's like, let me think of how to explain it. If you sprained your ankle and you were trying to train for a marathon, I mean, one, you wouldn't be able to do it that effectively because you've got a compensatory movement pattern, because you're not going to be using the weight properly on the ankle that's been affected or that's injured. So when you think about it think about it like that. Think about it as the horse now has not a disability, but they're not playing with all the cards in the deck. You know what I mean?
It would be like trying to train for a marathon by running on one leg, essentially. Like,
yeah, and that's kind of like how I like to explain compensatory movement patterns and why they're so detrimental to the horse, because you're not just looking at the inability to develop muscle, but you're also looking at the component where you've now opened the horse up for injury, because now they're weaker, they don't have the proper muscle development to move correctly, and not only that, they're compensating, which means different areas of the body are retaining more stress and more tension that aren't necessarily used to it. So to bring it back to the sprained ankle, if I'm kind of hobbling along trying to run or jog a half mile, well, my opposite knee might start to hurt. My opposite hip might start to hurt because it's bearing the brunt of the weight. It's trying to compensate for what's going on the injured side. And the same thing happens for the horse. So when we see the underdeveloped Toplines, or when we see the atrophied trapezius muscle or the overdeveloped brachiocephalicus muscle, or anything like that, it spans across the whole body. There's another area of the body that is compensating for the weakness and the pain and the underdevelopment that's been going on. I would just say, to me personally, nutrition is not the first thing I look at when it comes to trying to develop a top line. Typically, if the rest of the horse is decently developed and it's just a top line issue you're having, it can't really be attributed to nutrition. And that's typically when you have a nutrition issue, you see it systematically. It's not just the top line that's affected. So when you see these feeds that kind of promote, top line performance or top line, this is going to give your horse a magical top line supplement, that's not really what's happening. I mean, if your horse has a nutritional deficit in fiber or protein or something like that, minerals, vitamin E, whatever, then absolutely go ahead and supplement that. But don't expect there to be a magical top line cure-all.
There's not a top line specific diet.
No, I mean, you need to check all the boxes when it comes to the horse's nutrition. And if you're doing that adequately, then the top line is kind of taken care of. It's not, I don't typically see nutritional deficits specific to top line. You'll see it systematically.
Okay. One of the things that you mention in your top line training program is that many equestrians do not have basic knowledge on species specific care. I want you to explain what that means.
So species-specific care or species-appropriate care is the type of care that directly correlates with the horse and their natural environment and their bodies and anatomically what goes on with them. So you can attribute this to some of the big ones, I'll just kind of name it, are going to be your turnout and your nutrition. So when you have a horse that is confined to a stall and they don't have a lot of access to forage and things like that, those are two big factors that environmentally we as humans have taken and we've kind of put them in this little very manicured box, right? So we have horses that are very expensive maybe, or we just don't have the land or the means or whatever, and we have them that they're stalled a lot. There's not a lot of turnout time, which means there's not a lot of movement. Well, the movement, when you think about the horse's body, they're meant to be traversing miles and miles and miles on a daily basis over varied terrain. And a lot of people will use the argument of, oh, well, they're domesticated now, so that's not the case. Well, it is the case. It is. They're quote unquote domesticated, but not to the point where their bodies don't need to function in that natural form. So when you take that aspect away, you take the movement away, we start to see some problems. So when I talk about species appropriate care, turnout and movement is a big part of it. And then there's also the nutritional aspects of you need to be providing the horse with the forage and the appropriate amount of feed and access to feed during the day to help correlate with how their digestive system works. So the GI and then also the nutritional elements of that. In my experience, even the quote unquote hard keepers are not that hard to keep when they have the appropriate amount of forage. So I would say, and also species appropriate care when it comes to creating healthy feet, things like that. So those are kind of be my two main things would be environmental factors for species appropriate care and nutritional aspects. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a barn and it's just chronic. The whole barn like has colic episodes all the time, but it's because, well, how much hay are you feeding? Are you keeping your horse in the stall 12 hours at night with 2 flakes of hay? Because they finish that in the first 40 minutes and then they're just standing there. So they don't have access to movement, which blocks up the GI, and they also don't have forage. They don't have any long burning fiber that supports the hindgut because you haven't given it to them. So those are some of the things, without going down a rabbit hole, that I like to talk about when it comes to species appropriate care.
Do you see a difference in the musculature of horses that receive a great deal of turnout and get a lot of movement versus those that do not, that are more stuck in their stalls?
100%. Absolutely, there is a huge difference between horses that have access to a lot of turnout and a lot of movement on a daily and nightly basis versus horses that don't. I've seen horses who are on 24/7 turnout and minimal work have better muscle tone and better development, better, healthier joints, specifically when it comes to the stifle, be healthier in that aspect than horses who are, 6-figure horses in high-end barns who are ridden 4 to 5 times a week. However, they're stalled the majority of the time. And this goes back to the species appropriate care. When you think about the horse's body and how they're meant to move, movement is your friend. Movement's going to be your friend for the digestive system, for the feet, for the joints, for the muscle development. Movement is your friend.
There's a couple of posts actually that you've done on your social media pages, and they get a lot of comments and they get a lot of engagement, and they are photos that are taken at jogs at top 3-day events or top shows. And you've pointed out these very atrophied toplines that are often dismissed as that's just a very fit horse. Like the thing that I always think of is like that huge, shark fin wither with like a dip in front. So it looks like the neck comes out really low. I mean, I will share my own experience with this. The first time that I went to what was then Rolex Kentucky 3-day event was in 2009. I was doing eventing at the time as well, so this was like a huge dream for me to get to go to this event and watch it live for the first time in person. And I remember standing at the jog and watching these horses jog, and I was like, they all kind of look like their backs are all kind of the same. That's interesting. And I also remember thinking they all look like their necks come out rather low from their bodies. Like they look more downhill than like, because I had of course I've watched these horses with saddles on and being worked, and then I'd seen them in video and all of that sort of thing, and they looked quite uphill in the dressage test and everything. So when I saw them kind of without saddles and just going down the jog strip, I thought they look different than I thought that they would when everything is taken off of them. And I remember making this comment where I said, and actually my mom actually commented about this as well. Mom, if you're listening, I remember this. Good horsewoman. She said, yeah, they all look real skinny and their backs look real skinny and they all have this huge wither. Almost like that was like an anatomical component, like an advantage to like the shark fin wither would make them Michael Phelps or something. Like it was like an anatomical advantage to their job.
Very dynamic.
Yeah. And I remember saying that to somebody who was with us, and she said the thing that we now know is really a common misconception, and I think we can myth bust this a little bit. Well, they're all just so incredibly fit, and that's just what a really, really fit horse looks like. I mean, look at a marathon runner. You know, they look pretty gaunt and thin too, and you can kind of see their bones or whatever. And so that sat with me for a long time, and I just kind of thought, interesting. Didn't know any better at the time. Now we know a lot more about this process. Why are those top lines not just the result of a fit, lean horse?
So when we're looking at fitness versus lean, I mean, I think that it's like you said, we do have to get into a little bit of myth busting here. And I know that it's very commonly associated with eventing and the horses that are running cross country, and they tend to have a shark fin wither, and there tends to be the comparison, like you said, of, oh, they're just very fit, they're kind of like a marathon runner, XYZ, whatever it is. But the bottom line is underdevelopment is underdevelopment. When you see a shark fin wither like that, yes, different breeds and conformation play a role. You might actually physically post-mortem have a wither that is longer or thinner or wider than a different breed of a horse, right? But that doesn't change the fact that had that horse had a developed trapezius muscle spanning the wither or a developed latissimus dorsi behind the scapula, they wouldn't have that huge pocket and that huge dip and that huge what looks to be visually a shark fin wither if they had the muscular development. So the bottom line is atrophy and underdevelopment is what it is. It doesn't matter what the discipline is, and I think that it just becomes really difficult for equestrians to grasp the concept of something that's been so normalized. So it's like we're having, like you said, we're having to myth bust. We're having to go in and disrupt the norm and say, hey, you know, this radical idea that these horses aren't actually well developed, they are underdeveloped. It's not just lean, it's that they're unfit. And a lot of times, you know, you see these saddle fit comes into play again when you have these horses that are all ridden in these very close contact saddles that are meant to sit to provide performance for the rider, and it's maybe not necessarily conducive to proper development of those muscles, the top line muscles of the horse. So I think that it does play a role. And then you also kind of get into, which I don't want to ruffle too many feathers, but it also gets into you have to ask yourself the question, well, if this is what the horse looks like at the top of their game, and this is the elite fitness and this elite horse, well, is that ethical? I mean, is that actually an ethical state to compete the horse in? If that's the best that they're ever going to look or the best developed they're ever going to be, is that what we should be running around the 5 stars or whatever it is? So there's that question to be asked as well, but perhaps we'll leave that for another day.
Well, and I think that the thing that my mind immediately goes to is, having stood at a good number of those jogs, is that there are plenty of horses that do have well-developed top lines who are going down that jog strip as well. So it's not like this is a direct result of the sport that is across the board every horse's experience. And so then you have to look at, okay, well then what's making the difference? Is it equipment? Is it training? Is it, is it doing some of these, where we're going to go next, which is out of the saddle rehabilitation? Is it turnout? Most of the owners that I know, are pretty big turnout people, but, and that's a whole other conversation. Like there are definitely trends about species appropriate care having more prominence in certain disciplines than others. And like none of this is because anybody's like an evil person or whatever. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm saying that I used to believe that that is what a fit horse looked like. So like give yourself a little bit of grace because I
yeah,
totally believed it too. Like
absolutely.
we've
Absolutely.
come a long way.
Yeah, I think it's just it comes down to education, and it comes down to knowing anatomy and knowing the horse, knowing how to look for pain and knowing what underdevelopment looks like, because if you have those kind of foundational pieces, then you're more than equipped to make the right decisions for the
Yeah.
animal. You know what I mean? It come if you're just putting your head in the sand and you're just going with the masses and oh, nothing's wrong because this is how everyone's done it for years and years and years, and this is just the standard, then that's when we have to start questioning things.
Sure. Let's move into rehabilitating the top line. I know you are a very, very, very big proponent of getting off of the horse's back and working through exercises on the ground. Why is that so important for you?
Well, part of the reason is because of the relationship that the saddle and the rider have when it comes to underdevelopment or problems through the back and the top line. So when you eliminate the saddle and you eliminate the rider and you get the horse just doing the unridden work, then you're going to see faster results. You're going to see that development happen a little bit faster if the saddle and the rider were part of the problem. So that's one reason. Another reason I like to do unridden, get the rider off, is because the way the horse moves without a rider is very different. And a lot of times when you see the underdevelopment in the back, it's because the movement pattern of the horse. It's because of their biomechanical movement, and they're not able to build the right musculature because they're not moving properly. And to get them to move properly and kind of retrain that movement pattern, a lot of times this is much more successful when it's done without a rider. So you're teaching the horse balance, you're teaching the horse these transitions, you're teaching them the proper movement, the proper carriage without restrictive training aids, without gadgets, and you're teaching that foundational piece of it on the ground first, then put the rider back on. Then put the saddle on once it fits correctly. Then add those extra components to it. So that's why I'm just very, very big with unridden work. And I mean, I would say 95% of the time, it's the rider's worst nightmare to hear, oh, I've got to be off the horse for 6 to 8 weeks or whatever the case may be. But if you think about it, that's the problem. That's part of the like the contributing factor that got you there in the first place. You know, if you just took the time off, if you took time out of the saddle to do it correctly, to kind of establish those movement patterns and establish that training, you wouldn't be in this situation, you know, however many months or years down the road. So that's kind of a lot of what I preach is patience, doing it right the first time, getting all the knowledge, getting the full picture, and that way you don't have to kind of backtrack later on in the game.
Yeah. How long do you have you observed that it does take for, we'll say everything goes perfectly, that there's no sort of hiccups along the way. If somebody's really doing the work to rehabilitate their horse's top line, so they've taken a look at their nutrition, they've taken a look at their saddle, they have committed themselves to Turnout, they are working with a good body worker who's going to help break that pain cycle, and they're going to do these unmounted exercises. What is kind of the average horse's time period for you to actually start to be able to see or observe, see or feel a little bit of an improvement there, and for that muscle to start to build?
I would say if you were following the plan 100% and you, like you said, broke the pain cycle, got rid of that tension, were doing your groundwork, Turnout, adequate nutrition, all of that, visually, I mean, horses can develop musculature fairly quickly. So just like we know, I mean, it is pretty quick to lose weight, pretty quick to gain weight. So visually, I would say you could start to see some improvement and see a difference anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. That doesn't mean that your rehabilitation or your work cycle or whatever you're doing doesn't mean that you're done at 3 to 4 weeks. Typically, you know, in the rehab world, if you're doing, let's just say, a kissing spine rehab or something like that, it's 8 weeks unridden rehab. And at the end of the 8 weeks, you'd see a completely different horse. So when I say 3 to 4 weeks, do not mistake that, oh, I'm done now. It just essentially means you might start to see some visual differences. You might start to notice, oh, okay, I've got a little bit more development here, or I'm seeing a little bit of improvement in 3 to 4 weeks. So.
Ansley, at the end of every episode, we do something called Three Little Things. And these are meant to be actionable, low to no cost. Anyone can do them, low barrier to entry, steps that anybody can take to improve. What are three little things that you want horse owners and riders to do to promote a healthy top line in their horses?
Three things I think that they could do. One, I would say learn how to palpate your horse's back properly so you can look for indications of pain and tension. That's going to be a really helpful tool for every equestrian to have.
How should they do that? Should they ask their vet to show them? Should they ask their body worker to show them? What's the best practice for that?
I would say, yes, if you have an educated, trusted practitioner that you work with, whether that be a vet or physio, a body worker, I would say just make sure there are many different ways that you can palpate for pain, so I would just caution to find somebody reputable to learn that from.
You have a couple of reels on your Instagram about like kind of right and wrong ways to do it that are good. So
yeah, you can do that.
Yeah, so you can take at least like get a gut check on. I mean, it's hard to do any of that like on social media because no one can like Mark Zuckerberg, if you're listening. This is a hurdle for us. Like we can't feel what what she's doing. We can't feel the amount of pressure that you're using in that palpation, but it does show you a little bit about kind of positioning and sort of rights and wrongs and what you see people kind of doing wrong frequently versus what to do correctly. So they can go check that out.
I feel like I just had to throw that caution in there because sometimes you see people doing crazy things. So
like taking a hoof pick to scrape down a horse's back.
Yeah.
I've heard of people saying that they've seen that. But I have not seen that luckily myself before, but don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, if you do have a low budget to spend on it, I have a class called "Does My Horse Have Back Pain?" where we go in depth with palpation and things like that. So that's something you can look at as well. Otherwise, look at some reputable educational resources for that. So that's one thing you can do. I would say making sure that your saddle fits appropriately. So this is, I mean, I don't know in terms of cost if this fits into your box or not, but not a brand rep, but somebody who actually knows saddle fit and knows the anatomy and the biomechanics of the horse, knows how the horse is supposed to move, understands the musculature. Get somebody like that to check your saddle fit. And I don't care if you just had a custom saddle made 6 months ago, it doesn't matter. If your horse is struggling with a chronic back pain or you've been trying to build a top line and it's not working, that's what you got to look at. I'm sorry, but that needs to be within like the first 2 or 3 things that you do when you're trying to get to the root of the problem. So that would be number 2. And number 3, I would say write down your horse's routine. So how many days of ridden work are you doing versus days of unridden work? And when you're doing that ridden work, how long is it? What type of work are you doing? So it might be worth it for you to kind of just check your horse's schedule. Check that, because I think a lot of us, we look at our horses as a mental and emotional release for ourselves. A lot of us going to the barn is therapy. Getting in the saddle is our therapy. It's what we want to do. But at the end of the day, if the horse has a problem, if they're having acute or chronic back pain, or you're really having issues developing the back, you might need to check, hey, maybe I need to just be on the ground with my horse today and stay out of the saddle. So
I like that last one. That's a good one. That's a little bit of a sleeper. I wasn't expecting that one. So I like that. Write down your horse's schedule. Take stock of what you're actually doing with them. There's also a thing, and I find this with my own workouts, where sometimes I'm like, oh, I've worked out like 100 days in a row. And then if you actually start to like write down what you're doing and how many days you're doing it, there's kind of a perception versus reality kind of situation. I think our horses probably suffer from this often where we're like, "Oh, we're hacking a lot or we're doing a lot of out of ring work." And you're like, "No, you're not."
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that a lot, I can't remember where I heard this statistic, but it was like, I don't know, it was a long time ago, but somebody said it was like 80 or 90% of riders or whatever, whenever they go in the ring, they always go right. And they ride to the right, like X
Interesting.
amount. Like, yeah, it was like they ride to the right X% more than they ride to the left. And it was like it was a study that they did. And so it just goes to show you like what you think you're doing is not always what you're doing. Same thing goes for people who lunge. A lot of people, when asked how large their circle was, oh, I'm easily doing a 20-meter circle. When it was measured, oftentimes it was significantly less than 20 meters. So
Oh, that's
it's
good.
just, yeah, you think you're doing something and you're not actually always doing that. So like you said, maybe documenting or even just recognizing the horse's routine. Like you know, if you're looking for pain responses or discomfort or anything like that, is it always after you have a jump lesson? Is it always after you're riding with the saddle? Is it never after you're riding bareback? Is it, you know what I mean? Start to make these connections so that you can gather the evidence to kind of figure out where things are going or where things are coming from. That's a lot of times what I tell my students as well.
Yeah. Great. Ansley, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Everybody should check out your program on assessing and identifying top line dysfunction. And then you are also coming out on your platform with a number of classes around the back. What was the name of the back one that you mentioned again?
It's called Does My Horse Have Back Pain? And it really focuses on giving the student the tools that they need to properly identify pain and tension in the back.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.